Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the shadows of history, where some of the most powerful women who ever lived chose a path that shocked their families, defied their societies, and ultimately changed everything. These weren't queens with crowns or wives with wealthy husbands. No, these were women who lived quietly, often alone, and yet their influence echoes through every corner of our modern world. What if I told you that the very freedoms you enjoy today, the books you read, the medicines that save lives, even the clothes you wear, were all shaped by women who chose to walk their paths without a man by their side? And here's the most fascinating part. Most of them were considered failures by their own communities, labelled as spinsters or odd women, yet they possessed something their married sisters often couldn't access: complete and total freedom. Now, before we settle in for tonight's story, I'd love it if you could show some love by hitting that subscribe button and giving this video a thumbs up, but only if you genuinely connect with what we're exploring together. I'm curious too, where are you watching from tonight? Are you tucked in bed, maybe with a cup of tea, or perhaps you're winding down after a long day? Drop a comment below. I genuinely love hearing your stories. Now let's dim those lights, maybe turn on a gentle fan for some soothing background sound, and dive into this incredible tale together. Picture this. It's the late 1700s in England, and young women had essentially two paths in life: marriage or disgrace. There was no middle ground, no career ladder to climb, no independent life to build. A woman without a husband was considered incomplete, a burden on her family, a cautionary tale whispered about in drawing rooms. Yet, in this suffocating world of limited choices, something extraordinary was happening. Some women were quietly saying no to the only life society offered them, and in doing so they accidentally became the architects of our modern world. Think about it. When everyone around you is following the same script, when your parents, your neighbours, even your closest friends all believe there's only one way to live, it takes incredible courage to tear up that script and write your own. These women didn't have role models because they were creating the template for the first time in history. They were the original rebels, but their rebellion wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, persistent, and absolutely revolutionary. What's even more remarkable is that many of these women didn't set out to change the world. They simply wanted to live authentically, to pursue their passions, to use their minds and talents in ways that marriage and motherhood might not allow. Jane Austen, for instance, never intended to become the voice of romantic literature. She was just a woman who loved to write and happened to be brilliant at observing human nature. Florence Nightingale didn't wake up one day planning to revolutionize modern medicine. She was a young woman who felt called to help people and refused to let societal expectations stop her. But here's where it gets interesting. By choosing to remain unmarried, these women gained access to something incredibly rare in their time: autonomy. They could travel without asking permission, spend their money as they chose, dedicate their entire energy to their work, and most importantly, they could take risks that women with families simply couldn't afford to take. This freedom, this ability to be completely devoted to their calling, became their superpower. Consider this striking fact. In the 1800s, married women in most countries couldn't even own property. Everything they had legally belonged to their husbands. But unmarried women, they could inherit, they could earn, they could invest, they could build. While their married sisters were running households and raising children, incredibly important work, don't get me wrong, these single women were quietly accumulating not just wealth, but knowledge, connections, and influence. And society's reaction? Well, it was complicated. On one hand, these women were often pitied, sometimes mocked, occasionally shunned. The term spinster wasn't exactly a compliment, but on the other hand, they were also secretly envied and quietly admired. Other women would watch them and wonder, what would my life look like if I had that kind of freedom? What's fascinating is how these women supported each other. In a world that often saw women as competitors for limited male attention, unmarried women often formed deep, lasting friendships with other women. They created their own networks, their own communities, their own systems of support. They were pioneers not just in their individual fields, but in creating new models of how women could live and work together. The ripple effects of their choices are everywhere in our world today. Every time a woman starts her own business, every time she travels solo, every time she prioritizes her career or her art or her calling over traditional expectations, she's walking a path that these quiet revolutionaries carved out centuries ago. They didn't just change history, they changed what was possible for every woman who came after them. And here's something that might surprise you. Many of these women were actually quite happy with their choices. The stereotype of the bitter, lonely spinster is largely a myth created by societies that couldn't understand how a woman could be fulfilled without marriage. In their letters, their diaries, their writings, we see women who are deeply satisfied with their lives, proud of their work and grateful for their independence. As we prepare to meet some of these extraordinary women individually, remember this: they weren't superhuman. They faced doubt, loneliness, financial struggles, and social pressure just like anyone else. What made them different was their willingness to bet on themselves, to trust their own vision of what their lives could be, even when no one else could see it. So as we transition into our first story, I want you to imagine what it felt like to be a woman in Jane Austen's world. A world where your entire future was supposed to be determined by whether or not you could attract a suitable husband. Now imagine being brilliant, witty, observant, and creative, and discovering that maybe, just maybe, you had something more important to offer the world than becoming someone's wife. That realization, that moment of choosing yourself over society's expectations, is where our first story truly begins. In the quiet village of Steventon, Hampshire, there lived a woman who would accidentally rewrite the rules of love for millions of people she'd never meet. Jane Austen was 27 years old when she made a decision that scandalized her family and confused her neighbors. She turned down what might have been her last real chance at marriage. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. This rejection of conventional happiness would make her one of the most beloved voices in literary history. Now let me paint you a picture of just how radical Jane's choice really was. In 1802, when Harris Bigwither proposed to her, Jane was already considered past her prime in marriage terms. At 27, she was dangerously close to becoming what society cruelly called an old maid. Harris wasn't just any suitor, he was wealthy, well-connected, and could have provided Jane with financial security, a beautiful home, and social status. For one night, she actually said yes. Can you imagine the relief her family must have felt? Their brilliant but unmarried daughter was finally going to be settled, but then something extraordinary happened. Jane spent that night thinking, really thinking about what this marriage would mean. Harris was a good man, but he wasn't intellectually her equal. She would be comfortable, yes, but would she be herself? The next morning, she did something that shocked everyone. She changed her mind. She broke the engagement and chose uncertainty over security, independence over comfort. Her family was devastated. Her friend and Harris's sister Katharine felt betrayed. The gossip in their small community was merciless. People whispered that Jane Austen had lost her mind. Who turns down wealth and security for what? The freedom to write little stories that no one might ever read? But here's where Jane's story gets really interesting. That decision to remain unmarried didn't just change her life, it changed literature forever. You see, married women in Jane's time had very little time for sustained creative work. They were running households, bearing children, managing social obligations. Their days were consumed by other people's needs. But Jane had something precious and rare. Uninterrupted time to observe, to think, to write. And observe she did. From her position as an unmarried woman, Jane had a unique vantage point into society. She attended social gatherings without the pressure of impressing potential suitors. She watched marriages both happy and miserable, with the clear eyes of someone who had chosen differently. She saw how money influenced romance, how class determined compatibility, how women's intelligence was often seen as a liability rather than an asset. This perspective gave birth to some of the most insightful social commentary ever written. When Elizabeth Bennet rejects Mr. Darcy's first proposal in Pride and Prejudice, she's not just refusing a man, she's refusing to be bought, to be grateful for attention from someone who looks down on her family. That scene, which still gives readers chills today, could only have been written by someone who understood what it meant to say no to society's expectations. But let's talk about the practical side of Jane's choice, because it wasn't all romantic idealism. By remaining unmarried, Jane retained control over her inheritance and any money she earned from her writing. This was huge in an era when married women had no legal rights to their own income. Every penny Jane made from her novels was hers to keep, hers to spend, hers to invest. She became one of the first women in history to support herself entirely through her writing, and the writing itself. Well, it turns out that having the freedom to dedicate yourself completely to your craft produces pretty remarkable results. Jane wrote in the mornings before the household woke up, revised in the evenings after social obligations were met, and thought about her characters during long walks in the countryside. She had the luxury of perfectionism. She could revise and revise until every word was exactly right. Here's something that might surprise you. Jane Austen was actually quite funny about her unmarried status. In her letters to her nieces and nephews, she often joked about being the maiden aunt. When her brother's wife had yet another baby, Jane wrote, "I have now attained the true art of letter writing, which we are always told is to express on paper exactly what one would say to the same person by word of mouth. I have been talking to you almost as fast as I could the whole of this letter." She had a wit that could have charmed any husband, but she chose to share it with the world instead. The ripple effects of Jane's choice extended far beyond her own life. Her novels gave other women a new vocabulary for thinking about love and marriage. Before Jane, most popular fiction told women that finding a husband was their highest achievement. But Jane's heroines, Elizabeth Bennet, Emma Woodhouse, Anne Elliot, they were complex, intelligent women with their own opinions, their own moral codes, their own standards. They didn't just fall in love, they chose love, often after rejecting unsuitable matches. Think about how revolutionary this was. Jane was essentially writing instruction manuals for women on how to value themselves, how to recognize real worth in a partner, how to refuse to settle for less than they deserved. She was teaching women that it was better to be alone than to be with someone who didn't appreciate their mind, their spirit, their worth. And the men in her novels, they had to earn their heroines' love through character development, through proving themselves worthy of these remarkable women. Mr. Darcy doesn't get Elizabeth just because he's rich and handsome. He has to become a better person. Captain Wentworth doesn't win Anne Elliot back just because he's successful. He has to prove he still loves her for who she truly is. Jane was rewriting the rules of romance to require mutual respect, intellectual compatibility, and genuine affection. The financial success of her novels also proved something important. There was a huge audience hungry for stories about intelligent, independent women. Jane's books were bestsellers in her lifetime, and they've never been out of print since. They've been adapted into countless films, TV shows, and modern retellings. She created a template for romantic fiction that we're still following today. But perhaps most importantly, Jane proved that a woman could live a rich, fulfilling life without a husband. She had deep friendships, she travelled, she was involved with her nieces and nephews, she wrote letters that sparkled with wit and wisdom. She found love in many forms: love for her family, love for her craft, love for the absurdities of human nature. She died knowing she'd created something lasting, something that would outlive her and touch millions of lives. As we move forward in our journey through these remarkable women's lives, we're about to meet someone who took this idea of choosing service over marriage to an entirely different level. While Jane revolutionized how we think about love through her novels, our next woman revolutionized how we think about healing, about medicine, about what one determined woman can accomplish when she refuses to let society's expectations limit her vision. And trust me, Florence Nightingale's story will show you just how far that quiet rebellion against conventional life could reach. What if I told you that the woman who saved more lives than perhaps any general who ever won a war was once considered by her own family to be having a mental breakdown? Florence Nightingale's story begins not with heroics, but with the family intervention that would make any modern reality TV show look tame. Picture this scene. It's 1845, and 25-year-old Florence has just announced to her wealthy, well-connected family that she wants to become a nurse. The reaction. Her mother literally fainted. Her sister wept openly. Her father paced the room in bewildered fury. You have to understand, in Victorian England, nursing was considered only slightly more respectable than prostitution. Hospitals were filthy places where poor people went to die, and the women who worked in them were often drunk, illiterate, and morally questionable. But here's where Florence's story gets fascinating. She didn't just want to be a nurse. She had received what she believed was a direct calling from God to relieve human suffering. At 17, while walking in her family's garden, she experienced what she described as a divine voice telling her she had a mission. Most young Victorian ladies might have interpreted such a calling as meaning they should marry a clergyman and do good works through the church. But Florence, she took it literally and personally. Her family tried everything to talk her out of it. They offered her grand tours of Europe, introductions to eligible bachelors, and even the chance to manage their estate. Florence's mother, Frances, was particularly devastated because she had groomed her brilliant daughter for a life in high society. Florence was beautiful, well-educated, charming, and wealthy. She could have married anyone. Several suitors pursued her ardently, including Richard Monckton Milnes, a poet and politician who courted her for 7 years. But here's the remarkable thing about Florence. She understood something that most people of her time didn't. She realized that marriage, no matter how loving or comfortable, would end her independence and her ability to pursue her calling. In 1849, she wrote in her diary, "I have an intellectual nature which requires satisfaction, and that would find it in him. I have a passionate nature which requires satisfaction, and that would find it in him. I have a moral, an active nature which requires satisfaction, and that would not find it in his life." She turned down Milnes and every other suitor, not because she didn't want love, but because she wanted something more, the freedom to transform the world. Her breakthrough came when she was 31, ancient by Victorian standards for an unmarried woman. Against her family's wishes, she travelled to Germany to train at a Protestant hospital. The training was grueling. She learned not just basic medical care, but hospital administration, sanitation, and patient management. When she returned to England, she was ready to revolutionise healthcare, though nobody knew it yet. The opportunity came in 1854 when Britain entered the Crimean War. Reports were filtering back about the horrific conditions in military hospitals. More soldiers were dying from disease and infection than from battle wounds. The mortality rate was a staggering 42%. Sidney Herbert, the Secretary of War and a family friend, asked Florence to lead a team of nurses to the front lines. Her family was horrified, but Florence saw it as divine providence. What happened next would become legendary, but the reality was even more dramatic than the legend. When Florence and her team of 38 nurses arrived at the military hospital in Scutari, Turkey, they found conditions that defied description. The hospital was built over a sewage system that had collapsed, contaminating the water supply. There were no clean linens, no proper food, no basic sanitation. Wounded soldiers were lying in their own filth, and the death rate was climbing. Here's where Florence's unmarried status became her superpower. A married woman would have been expected to write worried letters home and defer to male authority. But Florence? She had no husband to answer to, no children to worry about her, no domestic obligations pulling her away from the work. She could dedicate herself completely to the crisis at hand, and dedicate herself she did, in ways that were absolutely revolutionary. First, she didn't just provide nursing care. She took on the entire military medical bureaucracy. Using her own money and her family's connections, she bypassed red tape to get supplies. She organised a complete sanitation overhaul of the hospital, bringing in scrub brushes, soap and fresh linens. She established kitchens to provide proper nutrition to patients. But here's the part that really shows her genius. Florence understood data. She kept meticulous records of everything: mortality rates, causes of death, recovery times, costs. She created what we now recognise as the first pie charts, colourful diagrams that showed visually how preventable diseases were killing more soldiers than enemy bullets. These charts became her secret weapon in convincing bureaucrats back in London that hospital reform wasn't just morally necessary, it was economically smart. The results were stunning. Under Florence's leadership, the mortality rate at Scutari dropped from 42% to 2%. 2%! She had essentially solved a medical crisis through organisation, sanitation, and data-driven decision-making. But Florence knew that dramatic statistics don't always translate to lasting change, so she did something brilliant. She became a master of public relations. The press dubbed her the Lady with the Lamp because she made rounds at night checking on patients. This image, the solitary, selfless woman bringing comfort to suffering soldiers, captured the public imagination. Back in England, Florence became a celebrity, a living saint. But she was far too smart to let fame go to her head. Instead, she used her celebrity strategically to push for systematic healthcare reform. When she returned to England in 1856, Florence could have easily settled into a comfortable life as a national heroine. Marriage proposals poured in from admirers who saw her as the ultimate Victorian angel. But Florence had bigger plans. She used her fame and her detailed data to launch a campaign for military hospital reform that would transform medicine forever. Working from her bedroom, she had developed what we might now recognise as chronic fatigue syndrome, possibly from her work in Crimea. Florence became the most influential healthcare reformer in British history. She wrote reports, lobbied politicians, and used her social connections to push through legislation. Her work led to the establishment of the first professional nursing school, the implementation of sanitation standards in hospitals, and the creation of modern medical record keeping. But perhaps most remarkably, Florence proved that a single woman could wield enormous political influence without holding any official position. She had no vote. Women couldn't vote in Britain until 1918, but she had something more powerful: expertise, data, moral authority, and the freedom to dedicate her entire energy to her cause. The ripple effects of Florence's work extend far beyond her own accomplishments. She created the template for modern nursing as a respected profession, established the importance of sanitation in medical care, and proved that healthcare reform could save both lives and money. Every time you visit a clean hospital with professional nurses and proper medical records, you're benefiting from systems that Florence Nightingale pioneered. Her choice to remain unmarried was absolutely central to her impact. She once wrote, "I have never found one man who could understand that I could live for anything but him." She didn't mean this bitterly. She meant it practically. She had work to do that required her complete attention, her total commitment, her undivided energy. As we continue exploring these remarkable women, we're about to encounter someone who took this idea of total dedication to art and pushed it to its most extreme and beautiful conclusion. While Florence revolutionized the outer world of medicine and public health, our next woman revolutionized the inner world of poetry and human expression. And Emily Dickinson's story will show you that sometimes the most powerful way to change the world is to retreat from it completely. Imagine becoming one of America's greatest poets while barely leaving your house for the last 20 years of your life. It sounds impossible, doesn't it? Yet Emily Dickinson managed to create some of the most profound and revolutionary poetry in human history from the confines of her family home in Amherst, Massachusetts. But here's the twist that will blow your mind. During her lifetime, only about 10 of her nearly 1,800 poems were ever published, and most people in her town thought she was just the eccentric woman who wore only white and baked excellent bread. Emily's story challenges everything we think we know about success, fame, and what it means to live a meaningful life. While other women of her era were fighting for the right to enter public life, Emily was proving that you could change the world without ever leaving your garden. Let's start with a mystery that has fascinated scholars for over a century. Why did Emily choose such radical isolation? She wasn't born a recluse. As a young woman, she attended Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, made friends, went to parties, and even had what appears to have been a romance or two. But sometime in her late 20s, she began what she called her selection, gradually withdrawing from social life until she rarely left her father's property. Her neighbours had theories, of course. Some whispered about a broken heart, others about mental illness, still others about family secrets. But Emily's own words give us a different picture. She wrote to a friend, "I never felt at home in the world. I find ecstasy in living. The mere sense of living is joy enough." For Emily, the external world wasn't insufficient because it was cruel or disappointing. It was insufficient because her inner world was so much richer and more interesting. And what an inner world it was. Emily developed what we might call a revolutionary approach to experiencing life. Instead of living broadly, she chose to live deeply. She would spend hours observing a single flower, watching the light change throughout the day, studying the habits of birds in her garden. She turned the ordinary act of being alive into a form of intense meditation and artistic practice. This approach to life was actually quite radical for a 19th century woman. Society expected women to be constantly busy with social obligations, household management, and caring for others. But Emily? She jealously guarded her time and energy for what she considered her true work, paying attention to existence itself and translating that attention into poetry. Here's where her unmarried status becomes crucial to understanding her achievement. Marriage in Emily's time would have meant not just a husband, but likely children, social entertaining, household management, and community obligations. All of these would have fragmented her attention and consumed the mental energy she needed for her poetry. By remaining single, Emily could dedicate herself completely to the life of the mind. But let's be clear, Emily's choice wasn't about avoiding love or human connection. Her letters reveal a woman of passionate intensity who formed deep, often romantic friendships with both men and women. She wrote love letters that were so intense they would make modern romance novels seem tame. The difference was that she refused to let conventional relationship structures limit her freedom to create. Her poetry itself was revolutionary in ways that are hard to appreciate today. In an era when most poetry followed strict formal rules and dealt with elevated subjects, Emily wrote about the smallest details of daily life in language that was startlingly direct and modern. She wrote about flies buzzing during death scenes, about the feeling of your brain splitting open, about hope being the thing with feathers. She used dashes instead of traditional punctuation, capitalized random words, and wrote in rhythms that matched how people actually think rather than how they were supposed to think. But here's what's truly extraordinary. Emily seems to have understood that she was creating something important, even though the world didn't know it yet. She carefully copied her poems onto folded sheets of paper, organizing them into what scholars now call fascicles, hand-sewn booklets that suggest she was preparing her work for future publication. She wasn't writing just for herself. She was writing for posterity, for readers who didn't exist yet but who would someday understand what she was trying to do. The numbers are staggering when you really think about them. Emily wrote nearly 1,800 poems in her lifetime. That's about one poem every week for 35 years. And these weren't simple verses dashed off quickly. They were dense, complex works that she revised meticulously. She would write multiple versions of the same poem, experimenting with different word choices, different line breaks, different ways of capturing the exact feeling she was trying to convey. Her relationship with fame is particularly fascinating. When a poem of hers was published in a local newspaper without her permission, she was reportedly upset not by the publication itself, but by the editor's changes to her punctuation and capitalization. Emily understood that her unconventional style was integral to her meaning. She would rather remain unknown than be misunderstood. This attitude toward fame was radical for any artist, but especially for a woman in the 19th century, when female authors often had to choose between anonymity and scandal. Emily chose a third option. She would write exactly as she wanted to write, preserve her work carefully, and trust that someday the world would be ready for what she had to offer. And what did her daily life look like? It was both extraordinarily ordinary and extraordinarily rich. She baked bread for her family, tended her garden, maintained correspondence with friends and family members, and cared for her aging parents. But she approached all of these activities with the intense attention of an artist. Her bread became legendary in Amherst. She would lower baskets of fresh-baked goods from her second-floor window to children playing in the yard below. Her garden was planned and planted with the precision of someone who saw each flower as a subject for contemplation. Emily's letters reveal someone who was deeply engaged with the intellectual currents of her time, even from her secluded position. She read voraciously Shakespeare, George Eliot, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, Ralph Waldo Emerson. She followed political events, scientific discoveries, and literary developments. Her isolation wasn't about ignorance or disengagement. It was about creating the perfect conditions for deep thinking and artistic creation. The tragic irony is that Emily died in 1886 without ever knowing that she would become one of America's most beloved poets. Her family discovered the extent of her work only after her death, when her sister-in-law found the fascicles in Emily's bedroom drawer. It took decades for editors to figure out how to present her unconventional style to the public, and it wasn't until the 1950s that her poems were finally published exactly as she wrote them. Today, Emily Dickinson is recognized as one of the founders of modern American poetry. Her influence can be seen in poets from Robert Frost to Sylvia Plath to contemporary writers who are still discovering new ways to read her work. She proved that you don't need to live a conventionally successful life to create something that will outlast everything your contemporaries considered important. But perhaps most importantly for our story, Emily showed that a woman could create her own definition of a meaningful life. She didn't need marriage to feel complete, fame to feel validated, or conventional success to feel fulfilled. She found everything she needed in the depths of her own attention to the world around her. As we move from Emily's intensely private revolution to our next story, we're about to meet a woman who took her fight for justice into the most public arena imaginable. While Emily proved you could change the world from your garden, Susan B. Anthony was about to prove that sometimes changing the world requires stepping directly into the lion's den of politics and power. And her decision to remain unmarried wasn't about retreat from the world, it was about preparing for battle. There's a moment that changed everything, and it happened in a tiny courthouse in Canandaigua, New York, on June 17, 1873. A 53-year-old unmarried woman stood before a judge who was so flustered by her presence that he could barely get through the proceedings. Susan B. Anthony had just done something that was technically illegal but morally inevitable. She had voted in a presidential election, and when the judge asked if she had anything to say before sentencing, her response would echo through history. "I stand before you tonight under indictment for the alleged crime of having voted at the last presidential election without having a lawful right to vote." But here's what makes Susan's story absolutely remarkable. This wasn't a moment of spontaneous rebellion. This was the culmination of a carefully planned life strategy that began decades earlier when she made a decision that shocked her family and friends. She would never marry, because marriage would end her ability to fight for justice. Let me take you back to 1856, when Susan was 36 years old and facing what her family considered a crisis. She'd received multiple marriage proposals from respectable men, including one from a man she genuinely cared for. But Susan had been watching her married friends and sisters, and she saw something that terrified her more than spinsterhood: the complete legal and practical disappearance of women's identities within marriage. Under the laws of coverture that governed 19th century America, a married woman literally ceased to exist as a legal person. She couldn't own property, sign contracts, keep her earnings, or even have legal custody of her own children. As Susan bluntly put it to a friend, marriage is not partnership, it is a form of slavery. And Susan B. Anthony was nobody's slave. But here's where Susan's strategic genius becomes clear. She didn't just reject marriage for personal reasons. She understood that as an unmarried woman, she possessed something that married women couldn't access: complete legal and economic independence. She could travel anywhere, speak to anyone, organize political movements, and dedicate every ounce of her energy to the cause of women's rights. Marriage would have ended not just her independence, but her effectiveness as a reformer. This calculation proved absolutely correct. From the 1850s until her death in 1906, Susan travelled constantly, giving speeches in hostile territories where married women would never have been allowed to go. She organised political conventions, lobbied legislators, and built a nationwide network of activists. Her unmarried status gave her the credibility to speak about women's rights from a position of independence, rather than as someone seeking to improve her own marital situation. The work was grueling and often dangerous. Susan regularly spoke to audiences that pelted her with rotten eggs and shouted obscenities. She was burned in effigy, threatened with violence, and mocked in newspapers across the country. In 1872, during a speaking tour in Kansas, She wrote to a friend, "I have been mobbed, egged, and almost shot, but I shall not stop until women have the ballot." A married woman with children to worry about simply couldn't have taken these risks, but Susan's strategic use of her unmarried status extended beyond just having the freedom to travel and speak. She understood that her single status gave her a unique moral authority to argue for women's rights. She couldn't be dismissed as a woman trying to gain power through her husband, or accused of neglecting her domestic duties. She was living proof that women could be complete, productive, moral human beings without marriage and motherhood. Her partnership with Elizabeth Cady Stanton illustrates this perfectly. Elizabeth was married with 7 children, which gave her credibility as a proper woman, but limited her ability to travel and organise. Susan was unmarried and childless, which gave her complete freedom of movement but made some people question her femininity. Together they created an unstoppable force. Elizabeth provided the intellectual framework and domestic credibility, while Susan provided the organisational energy and political strategy. The famous voting incident that landed Susan in court wasn't a moment of impulse. It was a carefully orchestrated piece of political theatre. Susan had been studying the Constitution and believed that the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship rights to former slaves, actually already gave women the right to vote. She convinced 15 other women in Rochester, New York to register and vote with her, knowing they would likely be arrested. The trial itself became a masterclass in civil disobedience. Susan had prepared extensively, studying law and constitutional theory. When the judge tried to prevent her from speaking in her own defense, she ignored him and delivered a speech that was immediately reprinted in newspapers across the country. She argued that she was being tried under laws she had no voice in creating, by judges she had no vote in selecting, and sentenced to pay fines she couldn't protest through the ballot box. The judge fined her $100, about $3,000 in today's money, which Susan refused to pay. "I shall never pay $1 of your unjust penalty," she declared, and she never did. The government eventually gave up trying to collect it, essentially admitting that prosecuting her had backfired spectacularly. But here's what's truly extraordinary about Susan's approach. She understood that her unmarried status gave her a unique form of political power. She had no husband who could be economically retaliated against, no children who could be threatened or used as leverage against her. She was essentially politically untouchable in ways that married women of her era simply weren't. This freedom allowed her to take increasingly bold stances. She openly supported divorce reform, arguing that women trapped in bad marriages were essentially slaves. She championed equal pay for equal work, pointing out that unmarried women like herself proved that women could support themselves if given fair opportunities. She even advocated for birth control, arguing that women should have control over their own bodies and reproductive choices. The financial aspect of Susan's strategy was crucial too. As an unmarried woman, she controlled her own earnings from her speaking tours and writing. She could invest this money directly back into the suffrage movement, funding newspapers, organising conventions and supporting other activists. A married woman would have needed her husband's permission for such expenditures, if she had any money of her own at all. Susan's influence extended far beyond the suffrage movement. She helped establish the principle that unmarried women could be taken seriously as political leaders, paving the way for future generations of single women in public life. She proved that a woman didn't need to be somebody's wife or mother to have moral authority and political influence. The statistical impact of her work is staggering. When Susan began her activism in the 1850s, women couldn't vote anywhere in the United States. By the time she died in 1906, 4 states had granted women full suffrage, and the national movement she had built was unstoppable. The 19th Amendment, passed in 1920, was often called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, in recognition of her foundational role. But perhaps most importantly, Susan proved that strategic spinsterhood could be a form of radical activism. By refusing marriage, she wasn't rejecting love or family. She was choosing a different kind of love, a love for justice that required her complete dedication. She once wrote, "Failure is impossible," and her life proved that a woman who refused to be limited by society's expectations of marriage and motherhood really could change the world. As we prepare to meet our next remarkable woman, we're moving from the political battlefield to the actual battlefield. While Susan fought for women's rights in courtrooms and lecture halls, Clara Barton was about to prove that an unmarried woman could literally save lives in the midst of America's bloodiest conflict. And her story will show you that sometimes the most profound act of service requires the complete freedom that only comes from choosing yourself first. On a scorching July day in 1862, a 40-year-old woman stood on the battlefield of Antietam, dodging Confederate bullets while bandaging Union soldiers. A musket ball tore through her sleeve, killing the man she was treating, but Clara Barton didn't flinch. She simply moved to the next wounded soldier. When someone later asked her how she found the courage to work so close to enemy fire, her response was both practical and profound. "I have no husband to worry about me, no children depending on me. I am free to serve where I'm needed most." This wasn't just bravery. This was the strategic advantage of spinsterhood weaponized for humanitarian purpose. Clara Barton had discovered something that would revolutionize disaster relief. Sometimes the most effective way to save lives is to have absolutely nothing to lose except your own. Clara's path to the battlefield began in the most unlikely place imaginable, a one-room schoolhouse in rural Massachusetts. At 18, she became one of the first women in her state to work as a professional teacher, and she was brilliant at it. She believed passionately that education could transform society, and she threw herself into teaching with the intensity of a religious convert. But here's where her story takes an unexpected turn. At 30, Clara faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. A well-established local businessman had been courting her for months. He was kind, financially secure, and genuinely admired her intelligence, unusual for the 1850s. Marriage to him would have meant comfort, social status, and an end to the whispers about why such an accomplished woman remained single. Clara seriously considered his proposal, but then she did something that reveals the depth of her character. She asked herself a question that most women of her era never dared to ask. What could I accomplish, she wondered, if I didn't have to ask anyone's permission? The answer to that question would ultimately save thousands of lives. Clara turned down the proposal, and instead did something almost unheard of for a woman in 1854. She moved to Washington, D.C., alone, to work in the patent office. She became one of the first women to hold a regular government job, earning the same salary as her male colleagues, a radical concept at the time. But even more importantly, this job put her at the center of American political life, just as the country was sliding towards civil war. When the war began in 1861, Clara watched trainloads of wounded soldiers arriving in Washington with inadequate medical supplies and care. The government's medical corps was completely overwhelmed, operating under the assumption that wars would be short and casualties light. But Clara, with her teacher's instinct for organization and her unmarried woman's freedom of action, saw an opportunity to fill a desperate need. Here's where her single status became crucial. Clara could do things that married women simply couldn't. She could travel to dangerous locations without asking a husband's permission. She could spend her own money on supplies without needing spousal approval. She could work 18-hour days without neglecting domestic duties. Most importantly, she could take life-threatening risks because her death wouldn't leave children orphaned or a husband destitute. Clara's first major innovation was recognizing that the real crisis wasn't in the hospitals. It was on the battlefields themselves. Wounded soldiers were often lying for hours or even days before receiving medical attention, dying not from their wounds but from lack of basic first aid. So Clara did something unprecedented. She decided to bring medical supplies directly to the front lines, often arriving before the official medical corps. The logistics of this were staggering. Clara used her own savings and her connections in Washington to gather supplies: bandages, morphine, food, blankets, surgical instruments. She organized wagon trains to carry these supplies to battlefields, often racing against time to reach wounded soldiers before it was too late. At the Battle of Antietam alone, she distributed supplies to over 9,000 wounded men. But Clara understood something that the military leadership didn't. Effective battlefield medicine required more than just supplies. It required someone willing to work in the middle of active combat. And this is where her unmarried status became her superpower. Military regulations prohibited women from being on active battlefields, but Clara had no husband to enforce those regulations on her, no family authority to answer to. She was legally and practically free to ignore rules that she considered immoral. The stories of her battlefield courage are almost unbelievable. At the Battle of Fredericksburg, she worked so close to Confederate lines that enemy soldiers could see her clearly. When Union officers ordered her to retreat to safety, she reportedly replied, "I may be compelled to face danger but never fear it, and while our soldiers can stand and fight, I can stand and feed and nurse them." She meant it literally. She often worked while bullets whistled overhead, never leaving her post until every wounded soldier had been treated. Clara's methods were revolutionary in ways that extended far beyond battlefield medicine. She kept meticulous records of every soldier she treated, creating what was essentially the first systematic database of battlefield casualties. She tracked supplies, monitored treatment outcomes, and documented the effectiveness of different medical interventions. This data would later prove crucial in reforming military medical practices. Her organizational genius became evident in how she managed her supply lines. Clara created a network of supporters across the North who donated money, medical supplies, and food specifically for her battlefield missions. She bypassed official military bureaucracy entirely, creating what was essentially a private humanitarian organization funded by civilian donations. This model would later inspire the creation of the American Red Cross. The numbers tell the story of her impact. Clara personally provided medical care to tens of thousands of soldiers during the war. Her supply operation supported medical treatment for over 60,000 wounded men. More importantly, her battlefield innovations reduced death rates from treatable wounds by an estimated 30% in the units she supported. But perhaps Clara's most important contribution was proving that women could be effective in roles that society considered exclusively masculine. She worked alongside military surgeons who initially resented her presence, but came to depend on her organizational skills and steady nerves under fire. General Joseph Hooker called her the best man on my staff, which was both a compliment and a recognition that her effectiveness transcended traditional gender roles. After the war, Clara faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could have settled into a comfortable retirement, perhaps even reconsidered marriage. She was 54, financially secure from her wartime savings, and famous throughout America as the angel of the battlefield. Instead, she chose to leverage her fame and experience to create something unprecedented: a permanent organization dedicated to disaster relief. Clara had learned about the International Red Cross during a trip to Europe and realized that America needed a similar organization. But establishing the American Red Cross required her to become a lobbyist, diplomat, and organizational entrepreneur all at once. This was work that would have been impossible for a married woman of her era, requiring constant travel, political networking, and the kind of public visibility that was considered inappropriate for wives and mothers, the American Red Cross, founded in 1881 with Clara as its first president, became her greatest legacy. Under her leadership, the organization responded to natural disasters across America, providing relief during floods, hurricanes, and earthquakes. Clara personally led relief efforts well into her 70s, proving that her battlefield courage wasn't a youthful aberration, but a defining characteristic of her approach to life. Clara's story reveals something profound about the relationship between personal freedom and public service. Her choice to remain unmarried wasn't about avoiding love or commitment. It was about choosing a different kind of love, a love for humanity that required her complete dedication. She once wrote, "The door that nobody else will go in at seems always to swing open widely for me. As we transition to our next remarkable woman, we're moving from the battlefield to the artist's studio, from saving lives to creating beauty that would inspire generations." While Clara proved that unmarried women could serve their country in times of crisis, Mary Cassatt was about to prove that they could also conquer the art world, even in a city and culture that seemed designed to exclude them. When Mary Cassatt stepped off the boat in Paris in 1874, she had exactly one thing that most aspiring artists didn't: the financial freedom to fail spectacularly without having to worry about feeding a family. At 30, she was considered practically ancient for an unmarried woman. But Mary had made a calculation that would change art history forever. She had chosen her paintbrush over a wedding ring, and she was about to prove that sometimes the most radical thing a woman can do is bet everything on her own talent. But here's the part of Mary's story that will surprise you. She didn't go to Paris to become famous or to join the avant-garde. She went because the art world in America was suffocating her. Back in Philadelphia, she'd been painting competent, conventional portraits that sold well enough to support herself. But Mary knew there was something missing, something that proper American art education couldn't give her. She needed to learn to see differently, and in 1874, Paris was the only place in the world where that was possible. The Paris that Mary encountered was a city in artistic revolution, but it was also a city that had very definite ideas about what women artists could and couldn't do. The prestigious École des Beaux-Arts didn't admit women at all. The major exhibitions, called the salons, rarely accepted women's work, and when they did, it was usually sentimental domestic scenes or delicate flower studies. The idea that a woman could be a serious artist, painting the kinds of bold, experimental works that were revolutionizing art, was almost unthinkable. Mary's first few years in Paris were a masterclass in persistence in the face of rejection. She studied with traditional teachers who told her to stick to appropriate subjects for ladies. She submitted paintings to the official salon and watched them get rejected or ignored. She lived in a tiny studio apartment, surviving on the modest allowance her family sent from America, watching male artists with half her talent get opportunities she could only dream of. Then, in 1877, something happened that changed everything. Mary was walking through an art dealer's shop when she saw a pastel by Edgar Degas. She later wrote, "I used to go and flatten my nose against that window and absorb all I could of his art. It changed my life. I saw art then as I wanted to see it." Here was an artist who painted modern life with a boldness and honesty that Mary had been yearning for but hadn't known how to achieve. What happened next was either the luckiest coincidence in art history or destiny working perfectly. Degas, who had noticed this American woman studying his work with unusual intensity, approached her about joining a group of rebel artists who were planning their own exhibition outside the official salon system. These artists, who would later be called the Impressionists, were being rejected by the art establishment for painting modern life in bold, unconventional ways. Now here's where Mary's unmarried status became her secret weapon. Joining the Impressionists was a radical, career-threatening move. It meant rejecting the traditional path to artistic success and allying herself with artists who were being mocked in the press as incompetent revolutionaries. A married woman would have needed her husband's permission for such a risky move, and most husbands would have forbidden it. But Mary was free to take a chance that could either make her career or destroy it completely. She chose to take the chance, and it was the best decision she ever made. Mary became the only American and one of only 3 women to exhibit with the Impressionists. But even within this revolutionary group, she faced challenges that her male colleagues never had to deal with. The Impressionists loved to paint the modern life of Paris, the cafes, the theatres, the bustling street scenes. But these were all places where respectable women couldn't go unaccompanied, especially in the evening when the light was most interesting. So Mary did something brilliant. She revolutionized what subjects could be considered worthy of serious art. Since she couldn't paint the nightlife of Paris, she painted the private, domestic world that she could access. Mothers with children, women at their toilette, intimate family moments. But she painted these traditional feminine subjects with the bold technique and modern sensibility of the Impressionists, proving that domestic life could be just as artistically significant as cafe scenes or dance halls. Her masterpiece, The Child's Bath, painted in 1893, is a perfect example of this revolutionary approach. Mary took a simple scene, a woman washing a child's feet, and painted it with such psychological depth and technical innovation that it elevated everyday domestic life to the level of high art. The composition, with its bold cropping and unusual viewpoint, was clearly influenced by Japanese prints, showing Mary's sophisticated understanding of non-Western art traditions. But Mary's real genius lay in her ability to capture the emotional truth of human relationships. Her paintings of mothers and children aren't sentimental Victorian idealizations. They're honest portrayals of real people in real moments. The children in her paintings look like actual children, sometimes cranky or squirmy or lost in their own thoughts. The mothers look tired, tender, absorbed in the daily work of caregiving. What's remarkable is that Mary was able to paint these intimate family scenes with such authenticity, despite never having children of her own. She understood that great art comes from careful observation and deep empathy, not necessarily from personal experience. She spent countless hours studying mothers and children, sketching them in parks and private homes, learning to capture the subtle dynamics of family relationships. Her technical innovations were groundbreaking in ways that are still being appreciated today. Mary was one of the first artists to master the complex medium of colour etching, creating prints that combine the precision of line drawing with the richness of painterly colour. Her prints were so technically sophisticated that other artists studied them to learn her methods. The financial aspect of Mary's independence was crucial to her artistic development. Because she remained unmarried, she controlled her own inheritance from her wealthy Pennsylvania family. This financial security allowed her to experiment with expensive techniques like colour etching, to turn down portrait commissions that would have paid well but compromised her artistic vision, and to support other artists when they were struggling. Mary also understood the business side of art in ways that many of her contemporaries didn't. She cultivated relationships with influential collectors, particularly encouraging wealthy Americans to buy Impressionist paintings. Her efforts were instrumental in building the American market for Impressionist art, which helped support not just her own career, but the careers of all the Impressionist artists. Her influence on American art collecting cannot be overstated. Mary advised the Havemeyer family on their art purchases, helping them assemble one of the most important collections of Impressionist and Post-Impressionist art in America. When this collection was eventually donated to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, It transformed the museum's holdings and exposed millions of Americans to revolutionary European art. But perhaps most importantly, Mary proved that a woman could be a serious, innovative artist without sacrificing her artistic vision to social expectations. She never married, never had children, and never apologized for choosing art over conventional domestic life. When people asked her if she regretted not having a family, she would gesture to her paintings and say, "These are my children." Mary's legacy extends far beyond her own artistic achievements. She paved the way for future generations of women artists who wanted to be taken seriously for their work, rather than patronized for their feminine sensibilities. She proved that women could master the most technically demanding art forms, could innovate in ways that influenced their male peers, and could build successful careers based on talent and hard work, rather than charm and connections. As we prepare to meet our next extraordinary woman, we're moving from the art studios of Paris to the halls of Congress in Washington, D.C. While Mary was proving that women could conquer the European art world through talent and determination, Jeannette Rankin was about to prove that an unmarried woman could enter the ultimate male bastion, American politics, and use that platform to take a stand that would define her place in history. Standing alone in the US, House of Representatives on April 6, 1917, Jeannette Rankin faced a choice that would either destroy her political career or cement her place in history. Around her, 373 male congressmen were preparing to vote for war, swept up in the patriotic fervour that was gripping the nation. But Jeannette, the first woman ever elected to Congress, was about to do something that would shock the country and prove that sometimes the most important vote is the one cast in complete isolation. When her name was called, her voice rang clear through the chamber, "I want my country to be the first country in the world that cannot go to war." This wasn't just political courage. This was the power of having absolutely nothing to lose except your principles. And Jeannette Rankin's principles had been forged by a lifetime of choosing independence over conventional expectations. Jeannette's path to Congress began in the vast landscapes of Montana, where she was born in 1880 to a family that had unconventional ideas about what their daughter could accomplish. Her father, a successful rancher, raised her to believe that intelligence and determination mattered more than gender. But even with this progressive upbringing, Jeannette faced the same choice that confronted every educated woman of her era: marriage or spinsterhood, domestic life or public service. The turning point came when Jeannette was in her 20s and working as a social worker in Seattle. She was engaged to a kind, successful man who offered her everything society said she should want: financial security, social status, and a conventional path to happiness. But as the wedding approached, Jeannette realized something that terrified her. Marriage would end her ability to make her own choices about how to spend her life, her time, and her energy. She broke the engagement and made a decision that scandalized her community but liberated her spirit. She would dedicate her life to political reform, specifically to winning the vote for women. But here's what makes Jeannette's story so compelling. She understood that to be effective in politics, she needed to be completely free from the traditional constraints that limited other women's political involvement. Jeannette's strategy was brilliantly unconventional. She began her political career not by seeking office herself, but by campaigning for women's suffrage across the western United States. She became one of the most effective suffrage speakers in the country, traveling from town to town in Montana, often camping outdoors when no hotel would accommodate an unmarried woman traveling alone. Her single status was actually an advantage. She could go anywhere, speak to anyone, and take risks that married women with family responsibilities simply couldn't take. Her speeches were legendary for their combination of logical argument and emotional power. In one famous address in Missoula, Montana, she said, The fundamental principle of democracy is the supreme worth of the individual. Montana has always been proud of its pioneering spirit. Why should we stop pioneering when it comes to recognizing the political equality of women? This wasn't just rhetoric. Jeannette genuinely believed that democracy was incomplete as long as half the population was excluded from political participation. The work was grueling and often dangerous. Jeannette travelled thousands of miles across Montana's rough terrain, often in harsh weather, speaking to audiences that range from sympathetic to openly hostile. She faced hecklers who threw objects, newspapers that mocked her appearance and questioned her femininity, and politicians who dismissed her as a naive idealist. But her unmarried status gave her something that married suffragists couldn't access: complete freedom to persist no matter how difficult or dangerous the work became. Her breakthrough came in 1916 when she decided to run for Congress herself. This was an almost unthinkable ambition for any woman, let alone an unmarried woman who was already considered radical for her suffrage activism. But Jeannette had calculated that Montana's unique political culture, shaped by the independence and pragmatism of frontier life, might be ready for a woman representative. Her campaign was unlike anything American politics had ever seen. Jeannette couldn't rely on the traditional political networks that supported male candidates, because these networks were closed to women. Instead, she built a grassroots coalition of women, farmers, and progressive reformers who shared her vision of a more democratic and peaceful society. She travelled to every corner of Montana, often in a car that broke down regularly, giving speeches in mining camps, farming communities, and small towns. The centerpiece of her campaign was her promise to vote for women's suffrage if elected to Congress. But she also ran on a broader platform of social reform and, crucially, her opposition to American involvement in the war that was raging in Europe. This anti-war stance was risky. Many Americans were beginning to support military preparedness, but Jeannette believed that women's political participation would bring a more peaceful approach to international relations. Against all odds, she won. On November 7th, 1916, Jeannette Rankin became the first woman elected to Congress, receiving more votes than any other candidate in Montana that year. Her victory made international news and inspired suffragists around the world. But Jeannette knew that her real test would come when she actually took her seat in Congress. The irony was heartbreaking. Jeannette arrived in Congress in 1917, but women still couldn't vote in most states, including Montana. She was representing constituents who had elected her but couldn't elect her successors. This contradiction motivated her to make women's suffrage her first priority, but events would soon force her to make an even more momentous decision. When President Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany in April 1917, Jeannette faced an impossible choice. Supporting the war would align her with the overwhelming majority of her colleagues and might help her political future, but it would betray her deepest convictions about the futility and horror of war. Opposing the war would isolate her politically and potentially end her career before it had really begun. Her decision to vote against the war declaration was made in the most painful isolation. She spent the night before the vote walking the halls of the Capitol, thinking about the young men who would die if America entered the war. She thought about her campaign promise to bring women's perspective to Congress, her belief that women's political participation would create a more peaceful world. When the moment came, Jeannette's voice shook as she said, "I want my country to be the first country in the world that cannot go to war." She was one of only 50 House members to vote against the war, and the only woman. The political cost was immediate and severe. Newspapers across the country attacked her as unpatriotic, colleagues shunned her, and her political future seemed doomed. But here's what's remarkable about Jeannette's story. She never regretted that vote. Years later, she would say, I felt at the time that the first woman to go to Congress should take the first stand, that the first time the first woman had a chance to say no to war, she should say it. She understood that her unique position gave her a responsibility to represent not just her constituents, but all women and future generations who would be affected by the decision to go to war. Jeannette's anti-war vote cost her re-election in 1918, but it didn't end her political career. She remained active in peace activism for the rest of her life, and incredibly, she was elected to Congress again in 1940. When World War II began, she was the only member of Congress to vote against American entry into that war as well, making her the only person in American history to vote against both world wars. The legacy of Jeannette's congressional service extends far beyond her war votes. She was instrumental in passing the 19th Amendment, giving women the right to vote. She advocated for social welfare programs, workers' rights, and international peace initiatives. She proved that women could be effective legislators and principled political leaders. As we continue our journey through these remarkable women's stories, we're about to encounter someone who channeled that same spirit of independence and refusal to conform into the glamorous but equally challenging world of Hollywood. While Jeannette was proving that women could succeed in politics without compromising their principles, Katharine Hepburn was about to prove that an actress could redefine what it meant to be a movie star, creating her own rules in an industry designed to control every aspect of women's lives. The year was 1934, and Hollywood studio executives were in full panic mode. Their newest star, Katharine Hepburn, had just shown up to a major studio meeting wearing men's trousers. Again, when the executives demanded she change into a dress like a proper lady, Kate's response became legendary. "I'll wear what I damn well please, and if you don't like it, you can fire me." But here's the twist that made Hollywood history. Instead of firing her, they realized they'd discovered something unprecedented. A woman who couldn't be controlled, couldn't be molded, and couldn't be told what to do. And audiences were absolutely fascinated by her. Kate Hepburn understood something that would take Hollywood decades to fully grasp. Authenticity was more powerful than perfection, and independence was more attractive than submission. But her path to this realization began with a choice that shocked her wealthy Connecticut family and would define her entire approach to life and career. Born into privilege in 1907, Kate was raised by parents who had unconventional ideas about their daughter's potential. Her mother, Catherine Martha Houghton, was a suffragist and birth control advocate, radical positions for a woman of her social standing. Her father encouraged Kate to speak her mind, compete with boys, and never apologize for being intelligent. But even with this progressive upbringing, Kate faced the same expectation that confronted every well-bred young woman of her era: find a suitable husband and settle into domestic life. At 21, Kate did exactly what was expected of her. She married Ludlow Ogden Smith, a wealthy socialite who seemed like the perfect match. But the marriage lasted exactly 6 years, and its failure taught Kate something crucial about herself. She was fundamentally incompatible with the role of traditional wife. She later said, "I was not meant to be a conventional wife. I would have made Ludlow miserable, and he would have made me miserable." The divorce, finalized in 1934, was Kate's declaration of independence from conventional expectations. But here's what makes her story so compelling. Instead of retreating into spinster respectability like many divorced women of her era, Kate used her newfound freedom to pursue the most unconventional career imaginable for a woman of her background. She became an actress. Acting in the 1930s wasn't considered a respectable profession for a woman, especially not for someone from Kate's social class. Actresses were often seen as morally questionable, their personal lives scrutinized and judged. The Hollywood studio system was designed to control every aspect of female stars' lives: their appearance, their behavior, their romantic relationships, even their weight and sleeping schedules. Stars were expected to be beautiful, compliant, and grateful for the opportunity to be moulded into whatever image the studio wanted to sell. Kate's first screen test was a disaster by conventional standards. The studio executives thought she was too skinny, too freckled, too outspoken, and definitely too independent. One famously said, "She has no sex appeal whatsoever." But Kate had something more powerful than sex appeal. She had an authentic, undeniable screen presence that made audiences unable to look away. Her very first film, A Bill of Divorcement in 1932, made her a star overnight, but stardom in Hollywood came with a price that Kate was unwilling to pay: complete surrender of personal autonomy. The studio system expected her to live according to their rules, date men they approved of, wear clothes they selected, and present herself as the kind of woman they thought would sell movie tickets. Kate's response was characteristic. She ignored every single one of these expectations. Her rebellion wasn't subtle. Kate wore pants when the studio wanted her in dresses. She lived alone when stars were expected to be either married or carefully chaperoned. She spoke her mind in interviews when she was supposed to give bland, agreeable responses. She chose her own romantic relationships based on personal compatibility rather than publicity value. Most shockingly, she negotiated her own contracts, demanding not just higher salaries but creative control over her roles. The financial aspect of Kate's independence was crucial to her artistic freedom. Because she came from wealth and had no dependents to support, she could afford to turn down roles that didn't interest her, or contracts that gave studios too much control over her life. When RKO Studios tried to force her into a series of lightweight romantic comedies, she famously bought out her own contract rather than compromise her artistic vision. This financial independence allowed Kate to make career choices that seemed risky, or even career-damaging at the time, but proved prescient in the long run. In 1938, she was labelled box office poison by theatre owners who thought her strong-willed screen persona was turning off audiences. Instead of changing her approach to win back popularity, Kate did something unprecedented. She found a play that showcased exactly the kind of strong, intelligent woman she wanted to portray on screen. The Philadelphia Story was Kate's comeback strategy, but it was also her masterpiece of career manipulation. She bought the film rights to the play before it even opened on Broadway, ensuring that if Hollywood wanted to adapt this surefire hit, they would have to deal with her on her terms. The strategy worked perfectly. The film version, released in 1940, earned Kate an Academy Award nomination and re-established her as one of Hollywood's most bankable stars. But Kate's most important contribution to cinema wasn't her individual performances. It was how she redefined what a female movie star could be. Before Kate, Hollywood's leading ladies were generally expected to be either virtuous ingenue or seductive femme fatale. Kate created a third option: the intelligent, independent woman who was neither innocent nor manipulative, but simply competent and self-possessed. Her screen characters reflected this new archetype. Whether she was playing a socialite in The Philadelphia Story, a lawyer in Adam's Rib, or a spinster missionary in The African Queen, Kate's characters were always women who knew their own minds and weren't afraid to speak them. They faced challenges not because they were weak or naive, but because they were strong enough to take on difficult situations. This approach to character was revolutionary because it suggested that women could be protagonists of their own stories, rather than supporting characters in men's adventures. Kate's characters didn't wait to be rescued. They solved their own problems. They didn't apologize for their intelligence. They used it to navigate complex situations. They didn't sacrifice their principles for love. They found partners who appreciated their strength. Kate's personal life reflected the same independence that characterized her screen roles. Her legendary romance with Spencer Tracy, which lasted 27 years until his death in 1967, was conducted entirely on her terms. Tracy was married to another woman and couldn't divorce due to his Catholic faith, which suited Kate perfectly. She had no interest in becoming anyone's wife again. Their relationship was based on mutual respect, intellectual compatibility, and shared professional interests rather than conventional romantic expectations. What's remarkable about Kate's approach to both career and personal life is how she managed to maintain her independence while achieving unprecedented success in an industry designed to control women. She won 4 Academy Awards for Best Actress, more than any other performer in that category. She worked with the greatest directors and actors of her generation. She commanded enormous salaries and had creative input on her films, all while refusing to conform to anyone else's idea of what a movie star should be. Kate's influence on subsequent generations of actresses cannot be overstated. She proved that audiences would embrace strong, intelligent female characters if they were portrayed authentically. She demonstrated that an actress could have a long, successful career without sacrificing her principles or personal autonomy. She showed that independence and success weren't mutually exclusive for women in Hollywood. Perhaps most importantly, Kate proved that being true to yourself was not only personally fulfilling but professionally advantageous. Her refusal to compromise her authentic self made her unique in a business full of manufactured personalities, and that uniqueness became her greatest asset. As we prepare to explore our next remarkable woman story, we're leaving the glamour of Hollywood for the stark beauty of the American Southwest. While Kate was redefining what it meant to be a movie star, Georgia O'Keeffe was about to prove that an artist could find perfect creative freedom in the most unlikely place, the desert of New Mexico. Her story will show us that sometimes the most profound independence comes not from conquering the world, but from finding the place where your soul can expand without limits. Picture this. It's 1946, and a 59-year-old woman is driving alone across the American Southwest in a black Ford sedan, with nothing but her painting supplies, a few belongings, and an unshakable conviction that she needs to live somewhere her soul can breathe. Georgia O'Keeffe had just made one of the most radical decisions of her life. She was leaving behind her marriage, her established life in New York, and everything that society said should matter to a woman her age, all to live alone in the high desert of New Mexico. When friends asked her if she was having a breakdown, Georgia's response was pure poetry. "I am not having a breakdown. I am finally breaking through." This wasn't a midlife crisis. This was a masterclass in how to redesign your entire existence around what truly matters to you, even when everyone thinks you've lost your mind. Georgia's journey to the desert began much earlier, in the most unexpected way. She'd been married to Alfred Stieglitz, the famous photographer and gallery owner, for over 20 years. On paper, it seemed like the perfect artistic partnership. He was one of the most influential figures in American art, and she was a rising painter whose work he championed and exhibited. But here's what the art world didn't see. Georgia was slowly suffocating in the role of Mrs. Stieglitz. The marriage had given Georgia access to New York's art world and financial security to pursue her painting, but it had also trapped her in a life that wasn't entirely her own. Stieglitz was 23 years older than Georgia, established and set in his ways, surrounded by a circle of artists and intellectuals who saw Georgia as his protégée, rather than an independent artist. She was living his life in his city, according to his schedule and preferences. The first crack in this arrangement appeared in 1929 when Georgia, feeling creatively stifled, took a trip to New Mexico with her friend Rebecca Strand. The moment she saw the vast skies, the ancient landscapes, and the quality of light in the high desert, something fundamental shifted inside her. She later wrote, "The colours are different up there. the blue-green of the sage and the mountains, the wildness. It is a different kind of colour from any I had known. But it wasn't just the visual beauty that captivated Georgia. It was the sense of space, both physical and psychological. In New Mexico, she could drive for hours without seeing another soul. She could paint what she wanted, when she wanted, without anyone commenting on her work or trying to interpret it for the press. Most importantly, she could live according to her own rhythms rather than the social obligations that dominated her New York life. Georgia began spending summers in New Mexico, renting simple adobe houses and painting with an intensity and freedom she hadn't felt in years. Her paintings from this period, the massive landscapes, the close-up studies of bones and flowers, the abstract interpretations of desert formations, were unlike anything she'd created before. The desert was liberating not just her life, but her art. The tension between her two worlds became increasingly unbearable. In New York, she was Mrs. Stieglitz, expected to attend gallery openings, entertain his friends and support his career. In New Mexico, she was simply Georgia, an artist alone with her vision. Stieglitz, growing older and more dependent on routine, couldn't understand her need for the desert. He saw her New Mexico obsession as a betrayal of their partnership and their shared commitment to developing American art. The breaking point came in the early 1940s when Stieglitz's health began to decline. Georgia found herself increasingly trapped in the role of caregiver, watching her own artistic energy drain away as she managed his medical needs and business affairs. She was in her 50s, at the height of her creative powers, but instead of painting, she was managing medications and receiving visitors who came to see the great Alfred Stieglitz. When Stieglitz died in 1946, Georgia faced a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could remain in New York, maintaining his gallery and preserving his legacy, living comfortably on the income from their art collection. Or she could choose freedom over security, independence over comfort, and move permanently to the place where her art came alive. Georgia chose the desert, and the art world was scandalized. Critics couldn't understand why a successful artist would abandon New York's cultural advantages for what they saw as cultural exile. Friends worried that she was making a decision based on grief rather than reason. Even her family questioned whether a woman approaching 60 should be living alone in such an isolated place. But Georgia understood something that her critics didn't. She was entering the most productive and innovative period of her entire career. Freed from the social obligations and artistic expectations of New York, she began creating some of the most powerful paintings of her life. Her large-scale landscapes captured the dramatic beauty of the desert with a boldness that influenced a generation of American artists. Her daily routine in New Mexico was both simple and revolutionary. Georgia woke before dawn to watch the sunrise, spent hours walking and driving through the landscape looking for subjects to paint, and worked in her studio during the heat of the day. She lived in houses with minimal furniture and maximum light, surrounded by the bones, rocks, and flowers that appeared in her paintings. She cooked simple meals, read voraciously, and went to bed early so she could wake up with the light. This lifestyle was considered almost scandalous for a woman of her age and social standing. Proper widows were expected to live quietly, perhaps near family, engaging in appropriate charitable activities and social functions. Georgia was living like a pioneer, driving dirt roads alone, painting outdoors in harsh conditions, and entertaining visitors only when she felt like it. But the results spoke for themselves. Georgia's New Mexico paintings were critically acclaimed and financially successful. Museums competed to acquire her work, and collectors paid record prices for her desert landscapes and flower studies. She had proven that artistic isolation could be more productive than artistic collaboration, that creative freedom was worth more than social acceptance. Georgia's approach to business was as unconventional as her approach to life. She maintained complete control over her work, personally overseeing every exhibition and sale. She set her own prices, chose her own galleries, and refused to sell to collectors she didn't respect. This level of artistic independence was virtually unheard of for artists of her generation, male or female. The financial success of her work allowed Georgia to buy and renovate several properties in New Mexico, creating a series of homes and studios that were perfectly adapted to her artistic needs. Her house at Ghost Ranch became legendary among artists and writers who visited. A spare, beautiful space that seemed to capture the essence of the desert landscape in its clean lines and dramatic views. Georgia's influence on American art extended far beyond her individual paintings. She proved that the American landscape could be as compelling a subject as the European scenes that dominated art collections. Her bold, simplified style influenced abstract expressionist painters and continues to influence contemporary artists today. Most importantly, she demonstrated that an artist could create their own definition of success, choosing artistic integrity over commercial pressure or social expectations. Her longevity was as remarkable as her artistic achievement. Georgia continued painting and living independently in New Mexico well into her 90s, adapting her techniques as her eyesight failed, but never compromising her artistic vision. She became a legend in her own lifetime, an artist who had chosen authenticity over convention and proved that the choice was worth making. But perhaps Georgia's most important legacy was showing that it's never too late to redesign your life around what truly matters to you. She was nearly 60 when she made her move to the desert, proving that the most important chapter of your life might be the one you haven't written yet. As we turn to our next extraordinary woman, we're moving from the vast landscapes of the American Southwest to the intricate world of marine biology and environmental activism. While Georgia was proving that artistic vision could flourish in isolation, Rachel Carson was about to discover that sometimes the most important discoveries happen when you're willing to look closely at what everyone else is ignoring. In 1958, a quiet marine biologist named Rachel Carson received a letter that would change the world. Her friend Olga Huckins wrote to tell her about a horrifying sight. After planes had sprayed DDT over her bird sanctuary in Massachusetts, she found dead and dying birds everywhere. Robins lay twitching on the ground, their beaks open in silent agony. The letter ended with a desperate plea. "Can't someone in Washington do something?" Rachel, who had spent her career writing beautiful books about the ocean, was about to discover that sometimes the most important work you'll ever do is the work that terrifies you, infuriates powerful people, and might destroy your reputation forever. What happened next would launch the modern environmental movement and prove that one unmarried woman with a typewriter and unshakable scientific integrity could take on the entire chemical industry and win. Rachel's path to this moment began in the most unlikely way, with a choice that seemed to doom her to spinsterhood and obscurity. Born in 1907 to a family of modest means in rural Pennsylvania, Rachel was a brilliant student who earned a scholarship to Pennsylvania College for Women. She started as an English major, dreaming of becoming a writer, but then she took a biology course that changed everything. She later said, "I thought I had to choose between writing and biology. It never occurred to me that I could combine them." This combination of scientific rigor and literary gift would become Rachel's secret weapon. But first, she had to navigate a world that had very definite ideas about what women could accomplish in science. When she graduated in 1929 and decided to pursue graduate work in marine biology, her professors warned her that science was no career for a woman. The few female scientists they knew lived in genteel poverty, teaching at women's colleges or working as assistants to male researchers, Rachel's response was characteristic. She ignored their warnings and enrolled at Johns Hopkins University to study marine biology. But the practical challenges were overwhelming. She had no family money to support her studies, and the Depression had made jobs scarce for everyone, especially women in science. She worked multiple part-time jobs while completing her master's degree, often staying up all night to finish her research after working all day to pay her bills. The turning point came in 1935 when Rachel's father died unexpectedly, leaving her responsible for supporting her mother and her sister's 2 young children. A conventional woman might have given up her scientific career and found a more stable job, perhaps teaching school or working in an office. But Rachel made a decision that would define her entire approach to life. She would find a way to support her family while pursuing her passion for marine science. She applied for a job with the US Bureau of Fisheries, taking a civil service exam that was theoretically open to both men and women, but had never been passed by a woman. Rachel not only passed, she scored higher than any man who'd ever taken the test. But when she arrived for her interview, the officials didn't know what to do with her. They had never hired a female scientist and weren't sure it was even legal. Rachel's strategy was brilliant. She convinced them to give her a part-time position writing radio scripts about marine life for a program called Romance Under the Waters. The job was perfect for her unique combination of scientific knowledge and writing ability, but it was also a clever way to get her foot in the door of government science. Within 2 years, she had proven herself so valuable that they offered her a full-time position as a junior aquatic biologist. This job gave Rachel something precious: the freedom to pursue independent research while supporting her family. Because she remained unmarried, she could dedicate long hours to her work without worrying about neglecting a husband or children. She could travel to remote research stations, spend weeks studying marine ecosystems, and work late into the night analysing data. Her unmarried status, which society saw as a limitation, actually became her professional advantage. But Rachel's real breakthrough came when she began combining her scientific expertise with her literary gifts to write books for general audiences. Her first book, Under the Sea Wind, published in 1941, was a lyrical exploration of ocean life that made complex marine biology accessible to ordinary readers. But it was her second book, The Sea Around Us, published in 1951, that made her famous. The Sea Around Us was unlike any science book that had ever been written. Rachel combined rigorous scientific research with poetic language that made readers feel the wonder and mystery of the ocean. The book spent 86 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list and won the National Book Award. More importantly, it established Rachel as one of the most trusted science writers in America. The financial success of The Sea Around Us gave Rachel something that would prove crucial to her later environmental activism: complete independence. She was able to quit her government job and dedicate herself entirely to writing and research. She built a cottage on the coast of Maine where she could study marine life firsthand and write without distractions. For the first time in her life, she was free to pursue whatever scientific questions interested her most. This freedom became essential when Rachel received Olga Huckin's letter about the bird deaths at the sanctuary. Rachel had been vaguely aware that the new synthetic pesticides developed during World War II were being used widely in agriculture and public health programs, but she hadn't realized their environmental impact. The letter prompted her to begin what would become 4 years of intensive research into the effects of pesticides on wildlife and human health. What Rachel discovered horrified her. DDT and other chlorinated hydrocarbons were accumulating in the food chain, becoming more concentrated as they moved from insects to birds to mammals to humans. The chemicals were causing eggshell thinning in birds, leading to reproductive failure. They were killing beneficial insects along with pests, disrupting entire ecosystems. Most alarmingly, they were showing up in human tissue and breast milk with unknown long-term health effects, but documenting the science was only the first challenge. Rachel knew that writing about pesticide dangers would put her in direct conflict with the chemical industry, which was making billions of dollars from pesticide sales. She also knew that as an unmarried woman scientist, she would be particularly vulnerable to personal attacks that questioned both her scientific credibility and her femininity. Rachel's strategy was methodical and brilliant. She spent 4 years building an absolutely airtight scientific case, consulting with hundreds of scientists, doctors, and wildlife experts. She documented every claim with multiple sources and subjected every chapter to rigorous peer review. She knew that the chemical industry would attack any weakness in her argument, so she made sure there were no weaknesses. When Silent Spring was published in 1962, it hit American society like a bombshell. Rachel opened the book with a fable about a town where all the birds had stopped singing, where fish floated dead in the streams, where children played in a world eerily quiet. It was science fiction, but it was based on scientific fact. The book's central argument was revolutionary. Humans were poisoning their own environment with chemicals whose long-term effects they didn't understand. The reaction was immediate and vicious. The chemical industry launched a massive campaign to discredit both the book and its author. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on propaganda that portrayed Rachel as a hysterical woman who was trying to bring back insect-borne diseases. One chemical company executive dismissed her as a fanatic defender of the cult of the balance of nature. Many critics questioned whether an unmarried woman could understand the needs of families trying to protect their children from disease-carrying insects. But Rachel had anticipated these attacks and prepared for them. Her scientific credentials were impeccable, her research was exhaustive, and her writing was measured and reasonable rather than emotional or alarmist. When she appeared on television to defend her work, she came across as calm, knowledgeable, and utterly credible. The contrast between her rational presentation and the industry's hysterical attacks actually strengthened her position. The impact of Silent Spring was immediate and far-reaching. President Kennedy ordered his Science Advisory Committee to investigate Rachel's claims, and they largely confirmed her findings. Public opinion began to shift dramatically against the indiscriminate use of pesticides. Most importantly, the book inspired a generation of environmental activists and led directly to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency and the banning of DDT in the United States. Tragically, Rachel didn't live to see many of these victories. She'd been battling breast cancer while writing Silent Spring, and she died in 1964. Just 2 years after the book's publication. But her legacy was secure. She had almost single-handedly created public awareness of environmental issues and established the principle that technological progress must be balanced against ecological consequences. Rachel's story proves that sometimes the most important work you can do is the work that makes powerful people angry. Her willingness to challenge an entire industry, armed with nothing but scientific evidence and moral conviction, changed how humanity thinks about its relationship with the natural world. As we prepare to meet our final few remarkable women, we're moving from the scientific challenge of understanding our environment to the personal challenge of rebuilding a life after devastating loss. While Rachel proved that one person could change how the world thinks about nature, Eleanor Roosevelt was about to prove that it's never too late to become the person you were meant to be, even after living most of your life in someone else's shadow. There's a moment that transforms everything, and for Eleanor Roosevelt, it came at age 61 when she walked into the first meeting of the United Nations Human Rights Commission and realized she was the only woman in the room. The men around the table, seasoned diplomats from powerful nations, looked at her with barely concealed skepticism. After all, What could the widow of an American president possibly know about international law or human rights? But Eleanor had something these distinguished gentlemen didn't expect. She had spent the first 6 decades of her life being underestimated, and she had finally learned to turn that disadvantage into her greatest strength. What happened in that room over the next 3 years would produce one of the most important documents in human history, and it was led by a woman who had spent most of her marriage believing she wasn't smart enough, capable enough, or important enough to change anything. Eleanor's transformation didn't begin with Franklin's death in 1945. It began much earlier, with a discovery that shattered her world and accidentally set her free. In 1918, while unpacking Franklin's luggage after a trip, Eleanor found a bundle of love letters from her own social secretary, Lucy Mercer. The betrayal was devastating, but it was also liberating in a way Eleanor couldn't have imagined. The perfect marriage that had defined her identity was revealed as an illusion, and for the first time in her life she was forced to decide who she was apart from being Franklin's wife. The woman who emerged from that crisis was someone the world had never seen before. Eleanor had been raised to be an ornament, beautiful, charming, and supportive of her husband's ambitions. But the discovery of Franklin's affair forced her to develop her own interests, her own opinions, and her own sources of fulfillment. She began writing, speaking publicly, and involving herself in political causes that mattered to her personally, not just to Franklin's career. When Franklin was stricken with polio in 1921, Eleanor's role became even more complex. She became his legs and eyes in the political world, travelling to places he couldn't go, meeting with people he couldn't see, and reporting back with detailed observations. This wasn't just the traditional role of a political wife. Eleanor was functioning as Franklin's intelligence network, his advance scout, and often his conscience on social issues he might have preferred to avoid. But here's what's remarkable about this period. Eleanor was developing her own political identity while appearing to simply support her husband's. She became an advocate for women's rights, racial equality, and workers' rights, positions that were sometimes politically inconvenient for Franklin, but were morally necessary for Eleanor. She was learning to navigate the complex balance between being a supportive wife and being true to her own convictions. The White House years tested this balance to its limits. As First Lady, Eleanor revolutionized the role in ways that shocked Washington society. She held her own press conferences and restricted them to female reporters only, forcing news organizations to hire women if they wanted to cover her stories. She traveled extensively, visiting coal mines, rural communities, and urban slums, bringing attention to social problems that previous First Ladies had ignored. She wrote a daily newspaper column called My Day that was syndicated to 90 newspapers and read by millions of Americans. Most controversially, Eleanor became a visible advocate for civil rights at a time when this position was politically dangerous for the Roosevelt administration. In 1939, when the Daughters of the American Revolution refused to let Marian Anderson, the famous African-American contralist, perform at Constitution Hall, Eleanor publicly resigned her membership in the organization and helped arrange for Anderson to sing at the Lincoln Memorial instead. The concert, attended by 75,000 people, became a defining moment in the civil rights movement. But it was Franklin's death in April 1945 that truly liberated Eleanor to become the person she was meant to be. She was 60 years old, and everyone expected her to retreat into dignified widowhood, perhaps writing her memoirs or quietly supporting charitable causes. Instead, Eleanor did something unprecedented. She used her newfound freedom to take on the most challenging assignment of her life. When President Truman asked her to serve on the United Nations delegation, Eleanor's first instinct was to decline. She didn't have formal training in international law or diplomacy, and she was intimidated by the prospect of working with sophisticated foreign ministers and seasoned negotiators. But Truman persisted, and Eleanor realized that this might be her chance to work for the causes she cared about most on a global scale. Her appointment to chair the UN Human Rights Commission was met with skepticism from many quarters. Foreign diplomats questioned whether an American woman could fairly represent global interests. American politicians worried that she was too idealistic for the hard realities of international negotiation. Even Eleanor herself wondered if she was qualified for such a monumental task. But Eleanor brought something to the job that her more experienced colleagues lacked. She understood suffering from personal experience, and she had a gift for seeing the human impact of political decisions. While the other commissioners debated abstract legal principles, Eleanor kept bringing the conversation back to concrete questions. What would this mean for a mother trying to protect her children? How would this affect workers trying to organize for fair wages? What would this do for minorities trying to escape persecution? The drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was a 3-year process that required Eleanor to master skills she had never needed before. She had to learn international law, study different legal traditions, and navigate the complex politics of the emerging Cold War. She worked 18-hour days, mastering briefing documents, and preparing for negotiations that could determine the fate of millions of people. The challenge was enormous because the Commission included representatives from countries with completely different political systems and cultural values. The Soviet Union wanted to emphasize economic rights over political freedoms. Islamic countries wanted to ensure that the declaration didn't conflict with religious law. Latin American countries wanted strong language about social justice. Western European countries were focused on individual liberties. Eleanor's genius lay in her ability to find common ground among these competing visions. She would begin each negotiating session by reminding the commissioners that they were writing a document for ordinary people around the world who wanted basic dignity and security. When debates became too abstract or ideological, she would tell stories about specific individuals she had met who embodied the principles they were discussing. Her approach was both practical and profound. Eleanor understood that the declaration would only be meaningful if it spoke to universal human experiences, the desire to speak freely, to practice one's religion, to have adequate food and shelter, to be treated equally before the law. She insisted that the language be clear enough for ordinary people to understand, not just lawyers and diplomats. The moment of triumph came on December 10, 1948, when the UN General Assembly voted to adopt the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The vote was 48 in favour, none against, and 8 abstentions. Eleanor had shepherded through one of the most important documents in human history, establishing for the first time universal standards for human dignity and rights. But Eleanor's work was far from finished. She spent the remaining 14 years of her life travelling the world, speaking about human rights and working to implement the principles of the Declaration. She visited refugee camps, met with political prisoners, and advocated for marginalized communities everywhere she went. She proved that the Declaration wasn't just a symbolic document, but a practical tool for improving people's lives. What's most remarkable about Eleanor's later career is how she managed to maintain her influence without holding any official position. She had no government title, no institutional power, no formal authority. But she had something more valuable: moral credibility and the respect that comes from a lifetime of standing up for one's principles. World leaders sought her advice not because they had to, but because they trusted her judgment and valued her perspective. Eleanor's transformation from insecure political wife to global human rights champion proves something profound about human potential. It's never too late to become the person you were meant to be. Her most important work didn't begin until she was past 60, an age when most people are thinking about retirement rather than revolution. As we near the end of our journey through these remarkable women's stories, we're about to encounter someone whose life was defined by pain, transformed into power, suffering channeled into revolutionary art. While Eleanor proved that it's never too late to find your true calling, Frida Kahlo was about to show the world that sometimes our greatest limitations can become our most profound sources of strength. September 17th, 1925. An 18-year-old girl named Frida Kahlo was riding a wooden bus through Mexico City when a streetcar slammed into it with such force that a metal handrail pierced through her pelvis and came out the other side. As she lay broken on the street, covered in gold dust from a fellow passenger's bag, witnesses thought they were looking at the death of a vibrant young woman who'd planned to become a doctor. Instead, they were witnessing the birth of one of the most revolutionary artists in history, because sometimes our most devastating moments become the foundation for our greatest triumphs. But here's what makes Frida's story absolutely extraordinary. She didn't just survive that accident, she transformed it into a source of creative power that would challenge everything the art world thought it knew about beauty, pain, and the female experience. Before the accident, Frida's life had been following a conventional path for an intelligent young woman in 1920s Mexico. She was one of only 35 girls admitted to the prestigious National Preparatory School, where she was studying to become a doctor. She was spirited, outgoing, and part of a group of student intellectuals who called themselves Los Cachuchas, the Caps, after the caps they wore as a sign of their rebellious solidarity. Frida had dreams of healing people, of using science to make the world better. She was politically engaged, intellectually curious, and seemingly destined for a career that would break barriers for Mexican women in medicine. But the accident changed everything. Her spine was fractured in 3 places, her pelvis was shattered, her right leg was broken in 11 places, and her right foot was crushed. The doctors weren't sure she would live, and if she did, they warned she might never walk again. What happened next reveals something profound about human resilience and creativity. Confined to bed for months, encased in a plaster corset that made it impossible to sit up, Frida was dying of boredom and frustration. Her mother, recognizing that her daughter's spirit needed nourishment as much as her body needed healing, made a decision that changed art history. She installed a mirror above Frida's bed and brought her painting supplies. Frida later wrote, "I never thought of painting until 1926, when I was in bed on account of a spinal injury. I was bored as hell in bed with a plaster cast, so I decided to do something. I stole from my father some oil paints, and my mother ordered for me a special easel because I couldn't sit, and I started to paint. But this wasn't just art therapy. This was the beginning of a revolutionary new form of artistic expression. Because Frida could only paint what she could see from her bed, her first subjects were herself and her immediate surroundings. She began creating self-portraits that were unlike anything in the history of art. Brutally honest, psychologically complex, and unapologetically focused on the female experience of pain, healing, and survival. Her first major painting, Self-Portrait in a Velvet Dress, painted in 1926, shows a young woman whose direct gaze challenges the viewer to see her as she truly is, not as an object of beauty or desire, but as a complete human being with intelligence, pain, and dignity. This was revolutionary because most paintings of women were created by men and showed women as men wanted to see them. Frida was showing women as women experienced themselves. As Frida's physical condition stabilized, she began venturing out into Mexico City's intellectual and artistic circles. It was at a political gathering in 1928 that she met Diego Rivera, the famous muralist who was 20 years her senior and already established as one of Mexico's most important artists. Their relationship would become one of the most passionate and turbulent love affairs in art history, but it was also a relationship that would profoundly shape Frida's development as an artist. Diego immediately recognized Frida's extraordinary talent, but more importantly, he understood that her perspective as a woman who had experienced profound physical suffering gave her access to emotional truths that most artists never reached. He encouraged her to paint her reality, the reality of pain, of medical procedures, of a body that had been broken and reconstructed, of dreams interrupted and redirected. But here's where Frida's story becomes even more complex. Her relationship with Diego was both a source of artistic inspiration and personal anguish. Diego was a serial philanderer who had affairs with numerous women, including Frida's own sister. Each betrayal wounded Frida deeply, but instead of retreating into depression or self-pity, she channeled her emotional pain into paintings that explored themes of betrayal, love, and female rage with unprecedented honesty. Her painting, A Few Small Nips, created in 1935 after discovering Diego's affair with her sister, shows a woman who has been stabbed to death by her lover. The violence is shocking, but the painting isn't just about personal betrayal. It's about the violence that women experience in a culture that sees them as property rather than people. Frida was using her personal pain to make universal statements about women's experiences. Throughout the 1930s, Frida's health continued to deteriorate. She underwent multiple surgeries, spent months in hospital beds, and endured chronic pain that would have broken most people. But each medical crisis became material for her art. She painted herself in hospital beds, wearing back braces, undergoing surgery. She painted her miscarriages with a clinical honesty that shocked viewers, but helped other women understand that they weren't alone in their experiences of loss. What's remarkable about Frida's approach to her physical limitations is how she refused to let them define her or limit her artistic ambitions. When she couldn't stand at an easel, she painted lying down. When her hands shook from medication, she adapted her technique to work with the tremor rather than against it. When travel became difficult, she created a studio in her bedroom that became as much a part of her artistic practice as any traditional studio space. Frida's paintings from this period were groundbreaking in their exploration of female experience. Henry Ford Hospital, painted in 1932 after a miscarriage, shows Frida lying on a hospital bed surrounded by symbols of lost motherhood, a male fetus, a flower, medical instruments. No artist had ever painted miscarriage so directly, so honestly, or with such emotional complexity. The painting helped other women understand that pregnancy loss was a legitimate subject for serious art, not something to be hidden or ashamed of. But Frida's influence extended beyond just the art world. She became an icon of Mexican national identity, celebrating indigenous culture and traditions at a time when many Mexican intellectuals were looking to Europe for cultural inspiration. She wore traditional Tijuana dresses, incorporated pre-Columbian symbols into her paintings, and created work that was unapologetically Mexican in its aesthetic and political sensibility. Her painting, The Two Fridas, created in 1939 during her divorce from Diego, shows two versions of herself sitting side by side. One wearing a European-style dress with a broken heart, the other wearing traditional Mexican clothing with an intact heart. The painting explores themes of cultural identity, emotional survival, and the multiple selves that women must navigate in a complex world. Frida's approach to pain was particularly revolutionary. Instead of hiding her suffering or trying to transcend it, she made it central to her artistic vision. She painted herself with exposed organs, with nails piercing her body, with her spine crumbling. But these weren't paintings of victimhood. They were paintings of survival, of a woman who refused to let pain silence her voice or diminish her power. Her influence on contemporary art cannot be overstated. Frida pioneered a form of autobiographical art that influenced everyone from feminist artists of the 1970s to contemporary artists like Tracey Emin and Kiki Smith. She proved that personal experience, especially women's personal experience, could be the foundation for serious, important art, but perhaps most importantly, Frida proved that limitation can become liberation if you're willing to work with what you have rather than mourning what you've lost. Her physical constraints forced her to develop an artistic vision that was uniquely hers, one that couldn't have emerged from a conventional artistic education or a life without challenges. Frida died in 1954 at the age of 47, but her influence has only grown in the decades since her death. She's become a symbol of artistic courage, of the power to transform suffering into something beautiful and meaningful, of the importance of telling your own story in your own voice. As we prepare to meet our final remarkable woman, we're moving from the world of art to the world of fashion, from paint and canvas to fabric and thread. While Frida proved that personal pain could become universal art, Coco Chanel was about to prove that one woman's vision of liberation could revolutionize how women around the world dressed, moved, and thought about themselves. At 12 years old, Gabrielle Bonheur Chanel stood outside the gates of the Aubusine convent, clutching a small bundle of belongings that represented everything she owned in the world. Her father had abandoned her there after her mother's death, promising to return but knowing he never would. As the heavy doors closed behind her, cutting her off from the outside world, young Gabrielle could never have imagined that this moment of abandonment would plant the seeds of a revolution that would liberate women from centuries of fashion oppression. But sometimes our deepest wounds become our greatest sources of strength. The nuns at Aubusine taught the orphaned girls practical skills: how to sew, how to mend, how to make simple, functional garments. They lived by a strict aesthetic of simplicity, wearing plain black and white habits, eschewing decoration for utility. Most girls endured this Spartan existence, counting the days until they could escape into the colourful, elaborate world of conventional femininity. But Gabrielle was absorbing something different. She was learning that beauty could exist in simplicity, that elegance didn't require ornamentation, and that the most powerful statement a woman could make was to refuse to apologize for taking up space in the world. When Gabrielle left the convent at 18, she had no family to return to, no marriage prospects, and no inheritance to sustain her. What she had was a fierce determination never to be dependent on anyone else's charity again, and a vision of women's clothing that would revolutionize how half the world dressed. But first, she had to survive in a society that offered limited options for young women without family connections. Gabrielle's first job was as a shop girl in a clothing store, but her real break came when she began performing as a cabaret singer in the evenings. It was during this period that she acquired the nickname Coco, possibly from a song she performed called Coco Rico, or perhaps from another called Qui a vu Coco. The stage gave her confidence and taught her the power of performance, but more importantly, it introduced her to men who could provide the financial backing she needed to start her own business. Her first patron was Etienne Balsan, a wealthy textile heir who became her lover and provided her with an apartment and an entree into high society. But Coco wasn't content to be merely a kept woman. While living under Balsan's protection, she began making hats for his friends, creating simple, elegant designs that stood in stark contrast to the elaborate feathered creations that were fashionable at the time. The breakthrough came when she met Arthur Boy Capel, an English businessman who became both her lover and her business partner. Capel saw Coco's potential not just as a mistress but as an entrepreneur, and in 1910 he helped her open her first boutique at 21 Rue Cambon in Paris. The location would become legendary, but at the time it was a modest shop where Coco sold the simple, practical hats that were already gaining attention among Paris's fashion-conscious women. What made Coco's approach revolutionary wasn't just her designs, it was her understanding that women's clothing had become a form of imprisonment. In 1910, fashionable women wore corsets that restricted their breathing, skirts so narrow they could barely walk, and hats so elaborate they could hardly move their heads. Fashion was literally constraining women's physical freedom, and Coco instinctively understood that changing how women dressed could change how they lived. Her first major innovation was the use of jersey fabric, a stretchy material that had previously been used only for men's underwear. Coco saw its potential for women's clothing because it moved with the body rather than restricting it. When she began creating dresses and suits from jersey, fashion critics were scandalized. The material was considered too common, too masculine, too practical for high fashion. But women loved it because they could actually move in Coco's clothes. The timing of Coco's rise was perfect, though she couldn't have known it. World War I was about to transform society in ways that would make her practical, liberating approach to women's fashion not just desirable, but necessary. As millions of men went to war, women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. They needed clothing that allowed them to work, to move, to function in roles that had previously been exclusively male. Coco's designs weren't just fashionable. They were functional in ways that traditional women's clothing had never been. During the war years, Coco's business exploded. Women discovered that they could be elegant without being immobilized, fashionable without being helpless. Her designs freed them from the tyranny of the corset and gave them clothes that worked with their bodies rather than against them. By 1919, she was employing over 300 workers and had become one of the most successful fashion designers in Paris. But Coco's greatest innovation was yet to come. In 1926, she created what Vogue magazine called Chanel's Ford, comparing it to the Model T car for its universal appeal and practicality. This was the little black dress, a simple, elegant design that could be dressed up or down, worn to work or to dinner, and looked appropriate in almost any situation. The concept seems obvious now, but it was revolutionary then. Before Coco, black was associated with mourning or servants' uniforms. She transformed it into the height of chic. The little black dress represented everything Coco believed about women's clothing. It was simple without being plain, elegant without being ostentatious, and practical without sacrificing beauty. Most importantly, it gave women a uniform of sorts, a way to dress that announced their competence and sophistication without requiring them to navigate complex fashion rules or spend enormous amounts of money on their wardrobes. Coco's business philosophy was as revolutionary as her designs. At a time when most fashion houses were run by men who designed clothes for women they didn't understand, Coco was a woman designing for women she knew intimately. She understood the practical challenges of women's lives because she had lived them. She knew what it felt like to be constrained by clothing because she had experienced that constraint. Most importantly, she understood that women wanted to be taken seriously, and she created clothes that announced their seriousness. Her financial independence was crucial to her creative independence. Because Coco maintained control of her business and never relied entirely on male financial backing, she could design what she wanted rather than what men thought women should wear. This independence allowed her to take risks, to experiment, and to stand firm when critics attacked her unconventional approach. The numbers tell the story of her impact. By the 1920s, Coco Chanel was employing over 4,000 workers across multiple businesses: fashion, perfume, and accessories. Her designs were being copied by manufacturers around the world, making her aesthetic accessible to women of all economic classes. She'd created not just a fashion house but a new way of thinking about women's clothing that influenced designers for generations. But perhaps Coco's most important contribution was proving that fashion could be political. Every time a woman wore one of her designs, she was making a statement about her right to move freely, to work comfortably, and to be taken seriously. Coco had weaponized elegance in service of women's liberation, creating clothes that announced their wearer's independence and competence. Her personal life was as unconventional as her professional life. Coco never married, though she had numerous high-profile relationships with wealthy and powerful men. She understood that marriage would have compromised her independence and limited her ability to build the business empire she envisioned. Her romantic relationships were partnerships of choice rather than economic necessity, which gave her the freedom to end them when they no longer served her interests. Coco's influence extended far beyond fashion. She challenged conventional ideas about femininity, proving that women could be both elegant and powerful, sophisticated and practical. She created a new aesthetic that valued simplicity over complexity, function over ornament, and authenticity over artifice. These values influenced not just fashion but design, architecture and culture more broadly. The legacy of Coco's work is visible everywhere today. The casual elegance that characterizes modern women's fashion, the idea that clothes should work with women's lives rather than against them, the concept that simplicity can be the height of sophistication. All of these can be traced directly to innovations that Coco pioneered nearly a century ago. As we prepare for our final reflection on these remarkable women and their lasting impact, we're reminded that Coco's story, like all the stories we've shared tonight, proves something profound about the power of individual vision and determination. These women didn't just live differently, they showed the world new ways of being, new possibilities for what women could accomplish when freed from conventional expectations. As we sit here together at the end of this long journey through history, I want you to imagine something remarkable. What if every woman in the world today could trace a direct line from her current freedom to the quiet rebellions of these extraordinary women we've met tonight? Because here's the truth that might surprise you. They absolutely can. Think about it. Every time a woman today chooses her career over marriage, she's walking a path that Jane Austen carved when she turned down her last chance at a husband to keep writing. Every time a woman enters a hospital and expects clean conditions and professional nursing care, she's benefiting from Florence Nightingale's revolutionary understanding that healthcare should be based on science, not tradition. Every time a woman speaks her mind without apologizing, she's channeling the spirit of Emily Dickinson, who proved that a woman's inner life could be as vast and important as any public achievement. The connections run deeper than we often realize. When Susan B. Anthony was arrested for voting illegally in 1872, she planted seeds that wouldn't fully bloom until 1920, when American women finally gained the right to vote. But the harvest from those seeds is still being gathered today, every time a woman runs for office, every time she stands up at a town hall meeting, every time she refuses to let someone else speak for her. Clara Barton's battlefield courage evolved into the American Red Cross, an organization that has provided disaster relief to millions of people around the world. Every time someone receives help after a hurricane, an earthquake, or a flood, they're benefiting from the organizational genius of a woman who refused to let convention keep her away from where she was needed most. Mary Cassatt's determination to succeed in the Parisian art world opened doors that are still opening today. When a female artist gets her first gallery show, when a woman's artwork sells for record prices at auction, when a mother and child are portrayed with dignity and complexity rather than sentimentality. Mary's influence is there, quiet but unmistakable. Jeannette Rankin's lonely vote against World War I established a precedent that echoes every time a politician chooses conscience over popularity, every time someone stands up to say that there might be a better way than violence to solve our problems. Her courage reminds us that sometimes the most important vote is the one that stands alone. Katharine Hepburn's refusal to conform to Hollywood's expectations created space for every actress who has ever insisted on playing complex, intelligent characters, who's ever demanded equal pay, who's ever chosen to age gracefully rather than desperately. Her authenticity became a template for being genuinely yourself in a world that profits from your insecurity. Georgia O'Keeffe's desert paintings changed how we see the American landscape, but more importantly, she proved that it's never too late to redesign your life around what truly matters to you. Every time someone makes a major life change after 50, after 60, after 70, they're following Georgia's example of choosing authenticity over security. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring literally changed how humanity thinks about its relationship with the natural world. Every environmental protection law, every banned pesticide, every cleaned-up river or protected wilderness area carries the DNA of her quiet courage in challenging powerful industries with nothing but scientific truth and moral conviction. Eleanor Roosevelt's transformation from insecure political wife to global human rights champion gives hope to anyone who has ever felt like their real life was waiting to begin. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which she shepherded through the United Nations, remains the foundational document for human rights advocacy around the world. Frida Kahlo's unflinching honesty about pain, about the female experience, about the complexity of identity, opened up artistic territory that thousands of artists have explored since. Every time someone creates art from personal trauma, every time someone refuses to prettify their reality for others' comfort, they're working in the space that Frida created. And Coco Chanel? Well, every time a woman puts on pants to go to work, every time she chooses comfort over convention, every time she dresses for herself rather than for male approval, she's participating in the liberation movement that Coco started with a simple belief. Women should be able to move freely through the world. But here's what ties all these stories together. What makes them more than just individual tales of exceptional women? These women understood something that their societies didn't yet grasp. They understood that choosing yourself, your authentic self, your true calling, your real values, isn't selfish. It's the most generous thing you can do, because when you live authentically, you give other people permission to do the same. Each of these women faced a moment when they had to choose between what society expected of them and what their hearts demanded. Jane could have married for security. Florence could have stayed safely in drawing rooms. Emily could have tried to write popular verse. Susan could have accepted that politics wasn't women's work. Clara could have stayed away from battlefields. Mary could have painted flowers instead of modern life. Jeannette could have voted with the majority. Kate could have played the roles Hollywood wanted. Georgia could have stayed in New York. Rachel could have remained silent about pesticides. Eleanor could have retreated into comfortable widowhood. Frida could have hidden her pain. Coco could have designed conventional feminine frippery. But they didn't. Each of them, in her own way, chose the harder path. The path of being true to herself, even when it meant being misunderstood, criticized, or ostracized. And in doing so, they didn't just change their own lives, they changed the world. Their legacy isn't just in the specific things they accomplished, though those accomplishments were extraordinary. Their legacy is in the proof they provided that a woman could live an authentic, meaningful, powerful life without a husband, without children, without following the script that society had written for her. They proved that there were many ways to be a woman, many ways to matter, many ways to leave the world better than you found it. Today, Millions of women around the world live lives that would have been unimaginable to most people in these women's lifetimes. Women are doctors and lawyers and scientists and artists and politicians and entrepreneurs. They start businesses, lead nations, win Nobel Prizes, and shape the future. They choose when and whether to marry, when and whether to have children, how to spend their time and energy and passion. None of this happened by accident. It happened because women like the ones we've met tonight were willing to be pioneers, to be the first, to be different, to be brave. They were willing to be laughed at, criticized, and dismissed because they understood something that their critics didn't. The future was bigger than the present, and someone had to be willing to step into it first. But perhaps the most important lesson from these remarkable women is this: you don't have to be extraordinary to make an extraordinary difference. What made these women special wasn't superhuman talent or unusual luck. What made them special was their willingness to listen to their own hearts, to trust their own judgment, and to act on their own convictions even when the whole world was telling them they were wrong. Every day, in small ways and large ones, each of us faces moments when we can choose authenticity over approval, courage over comfort, truth over convenience. These women remind us that those choices matter, that they accumulate, that they ripple outward in ways we might never fully understand. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, I want you to carry with you the quiet power of these women's examples. Remember that living authentically is not just a personal choice, it's a gift to everyone whose life you touch. When you choose to be genuinely yourself, you give others permission to do the same. When you follow your own path, you help clear the way for others to follow theirs. The women we've met tonight lived quietly in many ways, but they changed history precisely because they were willing to be who they truly were, without apology and without compromise. In a world that often seems to reward conformity, they remind us that the most powerful force for change is simply the courage to be yourself. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through the lives of these remarkable women. I hope their stories have inspired you as much as they've inspired me. These quiet revolutionaries prove that you don't need a crown or a title or a husband to change the world. You just need the courage to live your truth and trust that it matters. Sleep well, and remember, their revolution continues every time someone chooses authenticity over expectation, every time someone trusts their own voice over the crowd's opinion, every time someone decides that being true to themselves is more important than being approved of by others. Sweet dreams, and I'll see you soon for our next journey into the stories that shaped our world.